And none of them seem to admit of easy answers. In many ways, the internal tensions of our goals seem irreconcilable. I mean, how do we preserve online data privacy for users of products whose very purpose is hyper-personalized service? Or how is it possible for big tech platforms to keep the digital public square pruned, if you like, and free of criminal activity or other vices without inserting their own political or content biases into the editorializing that they're doing? What does competition even look like in this space? I mean, that's a really, really tough question. What does competition look like? I mean, after all, the supposed value of this space to consumers is a kind of integration. It's an integration of various services and various platforms, various lines of business, all in one place. And these, of course, are very important questions. They are much the questions of the day on Capitol Hill. I have my views on each of them, and they are rightly the subject of a quite serious debate, and I hope that debate will continue and extend. But I want to suggest to you today that, in a sense, all of those questions are downstream of a larger one, a bigger question, which I think we ought to be devoting more time to as a society, and I want to talk with you about briefly this afternoon. And that is the question of the worth of these social media platforms and the social media business model to begin with. What is its actual worth to the American economy and to American society? I mean, one of the most difficult things about acting in this area is the fear that any significant change in this space, any significant adjustment to the rules of the road, whether it be privacy requirements or content requirements, might end up stifling Silicon Valley, which we are accustomed to regarding, certainly we're told, as the great crown jewel of the American economy. But is it? Is it? It's heresy to say that here with Stanford University over my shoulder, but is Silicon Valley, the platforms, the products, the business models that it has been giving us of late, is this really the best that our best minds have to offer? And I won't hide my thesis from you. My thesis is I think the evidence is more and more strongly suggesting that there is something that is deeply troubling, maybe even deeply wrong, with the entire social media economy. That it does not represent a source of strength for America's tomorrow, but is rather a source of peril. Consider for a moment the basic business model of the dominant social media platforms. You're familiar with them. You might think of it as akin to financial arbitrage. Maybe we'll call it attention arbitrage. Users' attention is bought by the tech giants and then immediately sold to advertisers for the highest price, of course. Now, arbitrage opportunities, as those of you familiar with markets know, are supposed to close, right? I mean, the market eventually determines that something is off. How is it that this attention arbitrage in the social media market is preserved and renewed over and over again? And that's where things get really, really scary, because it's preserved by hijacking users' neural circuitry to prevent rational decision-making about what to click and how to spend time. Or just to simplify that a little bit, it's preserved through addiction. Social media only works as a business model, anyway, if it consumes users' time and attention day after day after day. It needs to replace the various activities we did perfectly well without social media for the entire known history of the human race with itself. It needs to replace those activities with time spent on social media so that addiction is actually the point. That's what social media shareholders are investing in. They are investing in the addiction of users. And I think that social media users actually understand this intuitively, even if they would put it a bit differently. You don't log on to Facebook to connect with a friend when you can just as easily call him or shoot her a text with your phone. You don't log on to find an article that you've been meaning to read when you could just as easily go and find that specific article yourself using a service or a platform that's designed to do that. Now, you log on to Facebook to be on Facebook. The attention arbitrage market itself becomes the destination. And we all know the effects. Our attention spans have dulled, our tempers have quickened, we reduce our friends to their public presentation in short posts, we substitute comments and likes for phone calls and direct human interaction, and those are the benign effects. Day after day, it seems, brings fresh data, fresh reports, fresh studies detailing the significant social consequences of social media use in such large quantities. Today's Washington Post, for instance, I don't know if you've seen it, has a chilling story about the rash of teenage suicide, especially in younger teenagers. Reporters walk through the evidence here. They trace the researchers' attempt to isolate what is driving this surge in teen suicide. They tried various theories mapped onto various events in society, and eventually what they discovered was the uptick. It's not just an uptick, it's a surge in teenage suicide, particularly among younger teenagers, coincides eerily with the introduction of the iPhone, particularly in its later models, which made where the social media platforms and the social media apps were readily available and optimized for use. Now, it could just be correlation, not causation. But as I say, day after day brings new studies that strongly suggest that there is a significant correlation, if not a causal relationship, between growing social media presence, between the avalanche of social media usage, and these terrible social consequences. Depression is another example. We're struggling society-wide with an epidemic of teenage depression and rising depression rates among young adults and older Americans, for that matter, too. And again, many studies now suggest that the time spent on social media and on social media platforms at least correlates to some degree with increased depression, loneliness. All of these social consequences, these are significant. You might even say that they are severe. And the question we need to be asking is, what is the role of social media in driving them, in encouraging them, in promoting them? And is this really something that is good for our society in the long term, or for our economy for that matter? While we're talking about the economy, think for a second about the opportunity cost that this social media business model and these social media platforms, which you might call the social media economy, think what it presents. This is what some of our brightest minds have been doing with their time for years now, designing these platforms, designing apps that integrate with them. I mean, what else might they have been doing? Just think about it. What else might these bright minds, these talented women and men have been doing that might have been truly productive for the American economy and for American consumers? We've encouraged an entire generation of our bright engineers in a discipline that provides little or no productive value to the United States economy, sucking them from communities that need their talents out to outposts on the coast, encouraging them to forget the problems of the people that they left behind. And of course, capital then follows them to those places. These are economic developments that reward some, there's no doubt about that, but attention arbitrage, like financial arbitrage, is no foundation for long-term growth. And that's my thesis to you today. You know, the most frightening thought of all of this is that the social media platforms might come to define our future economy. A social media economy. Imagine that. An economy that does not value the things that matter produces a society that is shaped in its own image. That, I want to suggest to you, is something that we cannot afford. It is something that we cannot allow. And it is within our power to change it. And that is the great challenge and task of our time. So to conclude, I want to say thank you again to Hoover for having me and for hosting this very important conversation. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us, as we consider the place that we're in now, as we consider the new era that we're living in, particularly those of us who believe in free markets, who believe in the free and open economy, to be asking ourselves, what kind of an economy are we encouraging? What kind of a society is that producing? And what is our responsibility, all of us, as members of that society, to shape it in the best way for the future? Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you.
No, yeah, so you've laid out a couple of really great examples of the issues that social media presents for us. And I'm wondering, like, in tackling these issues, what's the best way to be thinking about it? I mean, you have people saying, we need to approach this from a consumer privacy kind of, consumer protection issue, or using the antitrust laws, or you could use the antitrust laws to talk about, splitting up companies or whatever else. I mean, are you approaching it, and there's new legislation obviously on the floor, so what's the best way to think about really tackling all these issues that you've presented today?
Well, I don't think that there's any one right approach, and the scope of the policy areas that you've just mentioned in your question, I think, suggests just how big a problem this is, and just how pervasive an influence social media is. Certainly, there are antitrust questions. I mean, look, as Attorney General of Missouri, which is what I did before I was elected to the Senate, I launched the country's first investigation at the state level of Google, and it was multifaceted. I mean, we looked at, Missouri has quite robust antitrust laws, actually, so we looked at, the investigation was predicated on potential violations of antitrust, on potential associated anti-competitive behavior, on consumer welfare and consumer protection issues, and also privacy. You know, those are related but different concerns, and so Google alone, let alone these other social media platforms, touches all of those. So I think there's no one correct way to proceed. I think we need to look across the waterfront. I think we should not be hasty in what we do. I think that we should not barrel forth without, we need to have a robust discussion. But I, for one, think that one place where we ought to be able to begin immediately is on privacy considerations as it relates to children. And I've introduced legislation. It's bipartisan legislation. It's the first major piece of child privacy online legislation in over 20 years, and it would prevent online tracking of children. It would prevent advertisements directed towards children, and it would give parents, on behalf of their minor children up to age 15, a right to have their data deleted. It's the so-called eraser button, is what we like to call it. I think this is a great place to begin, and I hope that it will indeed pass this Congress this year and be enacted into law. And I think we ought to be looking at things like that. I want to say, to go back to markets for a moment, as a free market guy myself, I think it's important that the steps that we take be truly pro-market and pro-competitive. I mean, we need our free markets to be open and fair and to be functioning well. One of the things that concerns me most about the current climate of Silicon Valley is I'm not sure how competitive it actually is. But whether we're pursuing competition or whether we're pursuing privacy or whether we're talking about biases and deplatforming, whatever it is we do, I think it needs to be competition reinforcing. We want our markets to function. We want to promote innovation. We want to promote new entries into the market. So all of that, I think, has to be a major concern and has to be very much a part of what we're doing. It's a great question. Yes, sir.
Drew Clark with BroadbandBreakfast.com. Just building on that last question, could you...
It's a great name, BroadbandBreakfast.com. I love it.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah.
Just so building on this last question, could you speak specifically at Section 230? There's been a lot of discussion about reforms or eliminating it entirely. What is your position at this moment, and in your role on the Judiciary Committee? I mean, do you see that as something that could be addressed in the short term?
Well, I think we need to look at Section 230. I think we need to consider whether Section 230, as it's currently written, is functioning well, and whether it is giving us the outcomes that it was intended to give. You know, Section 230, I don't need to explain to you. I mean, it is obviously a tremendous benefit to those who can take advantage of it, but it is predicated on those media platforms who are covered by 230, on them providing open, fair, free platform for the exchange of ideas. Now, if they're not going to do that, if they're going to insert their own, for example, political biases into their editorial work, then they start to look a lot more like a traditional newspaper or a television station or other forms of media that we're quite familiar with, but who don't qualify for 230 immunity. So I think we need to ask ourselves, how is 230 really functioning now in the world of these dominant social media platforms? But whatever we do there and however we proceed, I think we need to be careful to make sure that it is not an incumbency measure, that it doesn't just benefit the dominant companies and further entrench them. This is a big concern of mine across the waterfront here, to go back to the previous question. In whatever steps Congress takes or other enforcement bodies, I think we've got to be very attentive to not having those become just a matter of entrenchment of existing platforms, because we have a competition problem, I think. And that's certainly in the 230 context. I would want to be very, very careful to make sure that new and smaller platforms are able to enter the market and are not at such a severe disadvantage that they would have no chance of ever competing and establishing themselves. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for answering our serious questions as opposed to your personal and lightweight speeches. But I teach at University of Virginia as well as in Chinese University of Hong Kong every year. And I'm really struck by your comment. I had another question, but I'm going to ask this one instead, which is much broader. I'm struck by your comment that Silicon Valley may not be the best that we have to offer. In today's hegemonic rivalry between us and China, Silicon Valley is one of our most important national security advantage. And I know that because at UVA and in Hong Kong and in Beijing, all of my best students want to go to Silicon Valley, even those in Beijing. So what you're saying, I'm asking the question of, I thought we were coming here to talk about net neutrality. Are you saying that we should revamp our entire system in Silicon Valley, the venture capital, the education system, or are we here to talk about sort of tweaking it to make it more competitive?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's not so much that I don't know that Silicon Valley represents the best and the brightest, but what is it Silicon Valley? Although I will say, I mean, let me just be on record as saying, I don't believe in this sort of Silicon Valley worship that says that it is unquestionably the very best of American society. I actually don't believe that at all. I don't think that's true. My question is, what has Silicon Valley been producing for the American economy and American society in recent years? And that, I think, is I mean, you've heard my thoughts on that. I think we need to question whether they're actually giving us the best, and whether the investment of their time and talent, our engineers, our software designers, our scientists, whether it's really being put towards truly socially and economically productive use. I do question that. However, let me come back to something else you said about national security. I'm delighted you raised this. You said that Silicon Valley's a national security advantage. Is it? I mean, is it? It's not clear to me that it is. Silicon Valley is. Let's be frank. What is it that Silicon Valley is most interested in? Making money. I mean, right? That's what they do. They're businesses. That's fine. However, Silicon Valley is now dominated by corporations that are multinational corporations who are only incidentally located in the United States. They don't view themselves as American corporations. They don't seem to exhibit any particular interest in or loyalty to the United States of America. Their interest is in their bottom line, their global bottom line, and they're happy to turn a profit wherever they may turn it. And their investment in China in particular, I think, is particularly worrisome. Because the Chinese economy, we know that investments made in the Chinese economy do not just stay in the Chinese economy. They inevitably flow to the Chinese military and to the repressive Chinese government, and are used to build an authoritarian state the likes of which this world has never seen before. I mean, you talk about, forget surveillance capitalism. I mean, surveillance communism is truly, truly startling. I think to a degree that most Americans have no idea. And we are in a new era of great power competition, and I am deeply concerned about the position of Silicon Valley in that competition. Now, look, I'm not saying that these companies that are based in the United States should be forced to help the United States military or forced to cooperate with DOD. I don't think that at all. But they don't have. But what I do think is they need to be very clear that their investments, partnerships, cooperation with China cannot be truly benign. I mean, it does not simply benefit the Chinese consumer. And my own view is I doubt these companies are terribly concerned about the Chinese consumer. I think they're probably more concerned about their profit margins. But it's not just to benefit the Chinese consumer. It benefits a repressive Chinese regime and a Chinese military. You know, our Joint Chiefs of Staff have recently been quite forceful on this topic. I think this is a discussion that we need to have. And that we need to hear more about because I'm very, very concerned about the trend lines here. Thank you for raising it. That's a very important question.
Last question.
Oh, I'm going to let you choose since it's the last question. How's that? Yes, sir.
Carl Szabo with NetChoice Center. I'm very glad that you're in Congress and very happy that you're here. I, like you, am about free markets and limited governments. Do you see a way to address some of the problems that you see not through government action, but through the free market and limited government solutions? And if so, how should we do that?
Well, yes. I mean, I hope so. I mean, look, markets are the creation. I'm a lawyer. Markets are the creation of the rule of law. You've got to have the rule of law in order for a market to function, right? And this is why conservatives, sometimes to a fault, talk about property rights. You know, we talk about assigning rights to folks, usually on the basis of some sort of value created, right? But we talk about assigning property rights to folks, having there be clear lines of assignment and then trade so that a market can function. That's how you stand up a market. I think part of the challenge we have now is this is a market, the social media market, the tech market is a market that is so new to us that our law hasn't kept up, and we're even having trouble conceptualizing what, for instance, do property rights look like. So take users' data. Again, this is all familiar to you in this room. In the last 10 years, say, the look and interface and feel of, say, Gmail to the average American consumer, it really hasn't changed that much. I don't mean that as a slam on Google. I'm sure it works beautifully. But in terms of how the consumer-facing portion of Gmail looks and operates about the same as it did 10 years ago. However, the business model behind Gmail has arguably changed quite significantly in that the amount of data that Google extracts from users in order to make Gmail free has changed significantly. So most American consumers think, because they're told, that the products that they use, whether it's the social media platforms or these other online products, are free. But they're not free. They're not free at all. So this is just one example of an area in which you might ask, is the market really well functioning when consumers don't know what's actually being taken from them, don't have any way to meaningfully to prevent it or to get it back? Can there really be a true buying and selling with the transparency that's necessary for a free, opening, and functioning market? I'm not sure that there is. So I see the challenge before us, not in terms of we need to impose a whole bunch of regulation to tweak stuff in the economy. We should be viewing this through the lens of market reinforcement. What do we need to do in order to make the market function in a way that is free, fair, and open? What do we need to do to make it function in a way that is healthy and that is sustainable in the long term? And I think that these are difficult questions. That's why to go back to the first question, that's why there is no one answer. Oh, this is the thing to do. But we do need to look across the waterfront, and we need to have in the midst of all of that, and this is I'll come back to my point today to you. We need to have in the midst of that a broader conversation about whether or not these business models and social media platforms in particular are truly beneficial to us economically or socially. Not so that we ban them, but so that we because we can decide, as this is the beauty of a free market, we can decide to what we give our attention, our dollars, our time. We need to have a conversation about this and decide, is this really what we want our economy to look like? Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be with you.